the story of Moses and the 10 plagues. A long time ago, in a land called Egypt, there was a mighty king named Pharaoh. Pharaoh ruled over the people with a heavy hand. He made the Israelites, God's people, work as slaves, building cities, and doing hard labor every day. The Israelites were sad and prayed to God, asking for help. God heard their cries and decided it was time to set them free. One day, God spoke to a man named Moses. Moses had once lived in Egypt, but he had run away many years ago. Now God wanted Moses to go back and ask Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. God told Moses, "Go to Pharaoh and tell him, 'Let my people go.'" Moses was afraid. "But I can't speak well," Moses said. "How can I talk to Pharaoh?" God replied, "I will help you. Take your brother Aaron with you. He can speak for you." Moses trusted God, and he went to Pharaoh with Aaron. They stood before the powerful king and said, "Pharaoh, God says, 'Let my people go so they can worship me.'" Pharaoh was very stubborn. He refused to let the Israelites go. "I don't know your God, and I won't let them go," Pharaoh said angrily. God had warned Moses that Pharaoh would not listen. But God had a plan. He sent Moses back to Pharaoh again and again, each time with a new warning. And each time, Pharaoh refused. So God sent 10 terrible plagues to convince Pharaoh to let the people go. The first plague, the Nile River turns to blood. The first plague was a sign that God was in control. Moses struck the Nile River with his staff, and the water turned to blood. The fish in the river died, and the Egyptians could not drink the water. But Pharaoh still refused to listen. The second plague, frogs everywhere. Next, God sent a plague of frogs. Frogs came up from the river and swarmed into every house. They covered the floors, the beds, and even the food. Pharaoh begged Moses to pray to God to remove the frogs, promising to let the Israelites go. But after the frogs were gone, Pharaoh changed his mind and refused again. The third plague, gnats. Then God sent gnats that filled the air and bit everyone. The Egyptians couldn't escape the tiny bugs. Pharaoh's magicians tried to do the same thing, but they couldn't. Still, Pharaoh refused. The fourth plague, flies. Next, a swarm of flies covered the land. They were everywhere, buzzing around food, animals, and people. The land became filthy, but Pharaoh still would not let the Israelites go. The fifth plague, the death of the livestock. God sent a plague that struck the Egyptian animals. All the horses, donkeys, and cattle of Egypt died, but the livestock of the Israelites were safe. Pharaoh saw this, but his heart remained hard, and he would not let the Israelites go. The sixth plague, boils. Then, painful boils appeared on the Egyptians and their animals. The magicians were so covered in sores that they could not even stand. But still, Pharaoh's heart remained hard. The seventh plague. God sent a terrible hailstorm that destroyed crops and animals. The hail was mixed with fire, and everything in the fields was ruined. Pharaoh promised to let the Israelites go, but when the storm stopped, he changed his mind once more. The eighth plague, locusts. Next, God sent locusts, which are giant grasshoppers that eat all the crops. The locusts devoured the rest of Egypt's food. Pharaoh begged Moses to ask God to stop, but when the locusts were gone, Pharaoh's heart was still hard. The ninth plague, darkness. God sent darkness over the land of Egypt for 3 days. It was so dark that the people could not see anything, not even their own hands. But the Israelites had light in their homes. Pharaoh still refused to let them go. The 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. Finally, God sent the 10th and most terrible plague. Every firstborn son in Egypt, whether human or animal, died. But God protected the Israelites. He told them to mark their doorposts with the blood of a lamb, and the angel of death would pass over their homes, sparing their children. Pharaoh's own son died in the plague, and he was heartbroken. This time, he knew that God had shown his great power. Pharaoh finally called for Moses and Aaron and said, "Go, take your people and leave Egypt at once." The Israelites were free at last. They quickly packed their belongings and left Egypt. Moses led them through the desert toward the land God had promised them. Pharaoh changed his mind one last time and sent his army to chase them, but God parted the Red Sea so the Israelites could escape. Don't miss part 2 of the story, the parting of the Red Sea. See how God's power continues to lead the Israelites to freedom. I hope you enjoyed the story of Moses and the 10 plagues. It reminds us of the power of faith and trusting in God's plan. With God's help, we can overcome any challenge, just like Moses did.
stubbornness will never die.